Allen's Investigate, airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans. Yay, and welcome to the Allen's Investigate with me, Shona Allen.
And I'm Gary Allen, the Cockney Bard.
And we're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans, and also on Roku. Now, this week, we'd like to welcome special guest Greg Moffitt, independent writer, editor and broadcaster based in England. Active since 1987, he has been published extensively both at home and abroad. He has over 30 years' experience in the music industry as both a musician and a journalist. He's co-author of Beyond Time and Space, The Art of Paul Raymond Gregory, and he currently hosts the Legalise Freedom podcast at www.legalise-freedom.com. Welcome, Greg. Lovely to meet you.
Lovely to meet you, Greg.
Hi, guys. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you for joining us. Indeed. So it's going to be quite an interesting programme tonight. I think probably more of a discussion off the cuff, really, with everything that's going on with the world at the moment. But I thought, first of all, if you don't mind, I thought we'd talk a little bit about yourself and your background, because I understand that you're a music writer, or you were a music writer for the BBC and rock magazines like Kerrang and Metal Hammer.
Yeah, that's correct. That's took up most of, so far, what's been, if you can call it working life. I published a fanzine, which, you know, some of your viewers, listeners may or may not know that term. You have to be of a certain age, I think. It's basically a magazine by fans, if you see what I mean. So simple little home-produced thing, you know, got it printed locally and distributed that. That was at the end of the 80s, and that led to me getting into music journalism in 1990 after a few years of doing my own thing. And then I was a musician for a number of years, but basically until relatively recently, I would say less than 10 years ago, I just gradually phased myself out of writing about music, and that's not something I do anymore. But it was a long time to be in that industry. But yes, I mean, the BBC was just one of the more famous outlets that I wrote for. But in hard rock and heavy metal and progressive rock and electronic music, it was really a who's who. I had the privilege to write for most of the top titles at home and abroad. So, but I mean, that in itself, I mean, that's another whole discussion, really, isn't it? What's happening to the music industry structurally? You know, the internet was such a huge disruptor for that. And I mean, what we're part of now, the so-called alternative media, the internet has in many ways allowed that to be, but also it continues to be a disruptor, as the models that people try to perfect, keep having to be evolved and changed as time goes on.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Greg, as well, that a lot of famous musicians are currently having a few problems and cancelling their tours and everything. What's going on?
Well, if you're referring to post-COVID stuff, there's been, I'm seeing a lot of articles about the costs of touring and the cost of travel. Of course, that's a major component of it for touring musicians, but that seems to be a major part of it. There's other factors, but it seems to be cost of travel, coming, say, for example, from the US to come and do a European tour or vice versa. That seems to have gotten very expensive. Flights, even things like insurance. Then you've got, some of your listeners will be familiar with what happened with Brexit, with the United Kingdom voting to leave the European Union. That's created a whole new strata of bureaucracy and costs associated, affecting all sorts of business, but music business in particular. So it's really for an industry that had gone through enormous changes in the previous 20 years. The whole COVID thing was really threw a hand grenade into the middle of it all. In fact, I produced a whole series of sort of video diaries during the pandemic period, One of which was like, COVID-19, the end of live music. I was speculating about what it might mean. It hasn't come to that, thank God, but it still looks possible.
I was going to say, because I mean, there were sort of rumblings at the time, during the lockdowns and things. I mean, obviously, no one could get out to see any live music or anything, and it was kind of, are we ever going to get to see live music and live bands ever again during that period?
Yeah, well, a lot of the political rhetoric, especially not just from national governments, but from super governmental, non-governmental organizations and corporate mouthpieces and bodies like the UN and the World Health Organization, was very much feeding us the line about the new normal. We're not going back to the way things were before. And to some extent, you could say that's happened in different areas of life. But certainly as far as music goes and other things, we're very much being told to get ready for never, ever going back to that. Again, a lot of that, I think, we managed to turn around and to claw back some of that, but certainly the talk for a long time was like, just give up on this. It ain't happening in future.
Yeah,
you can't believe it. It was so bad, wasn't it? And you're still seeing people today. They're walking around with their mask on or driving in a car on their own with their mask on. I don't think there's much hope for them, to be honest.
Well, no, look, people should do whatever they want to do as long as they're not hurting other people or interfering with other people's lives. But of course, a lot of people were hurt and a lot of people's lives were interfered with during that time. But if people want to run around doing that now, fine, you won't live a second longer. But maybe if you believe that you do, maybe it'll act like a placebo and you will. For me, I and a lot of people called it at the time, and we weren't. I don't know how you guys found that whole experience, but I don't think we were geniuses. I just from day one looked at what we were presented with and thought this can't be right. It doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely not.
And I gave it about a week. I gave it about a week of like, okay, they're telling us that this virus is going to sweep the earth. I've watched plenty of apocalyptic films. I know how this can pan out. Let's just see what happens. But after a few days of just listening to what was coming out of the media, I thought, this is not right. This is just not right. But of course, many people were scared into, fear mongered and propagandized into going along with whatever they were told to go along with. Even highly intelligent and educated people.
This is true. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely petrified people, weren't they?
But it did, and I think the thing is, I mean, something chemically happens to the brain as well. When you're in the fear state, your rational thought process is interrupted, and it all goes out of the window, and then you look to a sort of a figure of authority to listen to, and that's kind of what happens when you're in fear. You're looking for safety. It's like somebody throwing you a safety raft, really, isn't it? Yeah,
and also most people actually want to be led, whether they like to think that or not. You can see that even if it's not in, a lot of people will be scornful about leadership in the form of politicians, but most people really want to be told what's going on and what to do. And they don't want to work too hard. They want to have a certain amount of freedom in their lives. But for big questions, big answers, they want that fed to them. They don't want the responsibility that comes with true freedom, because then you're constantly having to make decisions and weigh them up and plow your own path and learn by your mistakes. And that's just too much. And we're not encouraged to do that, but it's just too much for some people. And of course, as far as fear goes, you're right about the chemical changes in the brain and body, and the sort of fight or flight, adrenaline reaction that a lot of people were living in for months at a time. Our body's not supposed to be like that for long at all. That's meant to be just, if you're being chased by a lion, that'll keep you going just long enough to climb a tree. You know what I mean? You're not meant to stay like that week in, week out.
No.
It's just stress. And who knows how many people that stress killed.
Well, I can remember walking around Tesco's and I never had a mask on, and I look round and everyone seemed to be having a mask on, and the way that they're looking at you as if you're some sort of alien or something. And I thought to myself, well, I mean, the mask to some degree will give you some protection, probably against people coughing and that. But obviously, the holes in the mask will let a virus in, wouldn't they? Surely.
Yeah, well, I mean, it almost feels like, we're going back to some of those debates and arguments about, do masks do any good or not, etc., etc. Was the vaccine given enough time to be developed? Was it effective? It feels like another time and place, which is good as far as I'm concerned, But you're right. There was, but again, people were told that. They were told this is what, that you or I or anyone else not towing that line, that we were granny killers basically. So it was an amplification of the way that politics and culture and society already were prior to that, which is black and white divisive. You're either with us or you're against us. Do you remember after 9/11 when George W. Bush, the poor idiot boy junior, came out with that, you're either with us or with the terrorists? There was no color, no room for nuance at all. And we've seen that continue now after the pandemic. I mean, things have cooled off a little bit, but we're seeing all of that in other areas of life as well. Any of the big contentious issues, you've got to be on one side of a fence or another, and it's all or nothing. But life isn't really like that. Most things involve nuance, color, changing your mind. God forbid you should ever do that. Changing your mind all the time can be a sign of weakness, but not doing it after you've received new information is also a sign of insecurity and weakness.
Absolutely. I mean, the point of it is, someone said to me, "Are you a conspiracy theorist?" I said, "No, I'm just a seeker of truth." I mean, if somebody shows you evidence and you are wrong about what you say, then surely you must be man enough to admit that you're wrong, and the evidence shows that you were wrong. So there's nothing wrong with that. But you find that when you're on Facebook and other stuff, and then you get this thing suddenly pops up saying, we're questioning what you're saying, and
the
fact checkers. Oh, it's unbelievable.
I mean, that's rich, isn't it, really? For me, facts have now become, they're subjective, really, a bit like truth is, a bit like reality is anyway. But, there was never anything, there was much less certainty in all of these matters than people thought in the first place, particularly during the pandemic period. And who's checking the fact checkers? It's the same old. It's all very 1984, isn't it? And that being, probably the best known dystopian tale in fiction. You had people who were editing the news and changing the past and all of that. And who was keeping an eye on them? Who watches the watchers? So this idea that this could be these people dispassionate and, distanced, from their emotions or their own ideas about things, to sit in judgment of other people. Even high court magistrates have got opinions. They try to keep all that personal stuff out of the courtroom, but there it is. We're all human beings, no matter whether scientists, lawmakers, police, politicians, podcasters. We've all got our own ideas, and we're all biased in subconscious ways that we a lot of the time don't like to acknowledge.
No, that's very true. I mean, the whole kind of thing that went on, it reminded me very much of the blueprint of how the Nazis operated, because, I mean, Joseph Goebbels, who was sort of the head of propaganda, wasn't he? He was Hitler's Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. And he basically controlled the radio, the press, publishing, and cinema, and the arts, and theatre. So he got all of the propaganda constantly into people's minds. And I think one of his very famous quotations is, "If you repeat a lie often enough, people will believe it, and you will even come to believe it yourself."
Exactly. Now, you mentioned the Nazis. I'm just looking up a reference here to a writer and broadcaster, an American playwright. I'm going to recommend his books and his blog to people. C.J. Hopkins. Now he's based in Germany, and one of his books is called "The Rise of the New Normal Reich," and he's been very adept and articulate at pointing out about how during the pandemic period, the behavior that happened, political, social, cultural during that time, the historical period it was most like was the Third Reich. But of course, you can't say that. That's really thorny territory. But in Germany, So yeah, it's worth reading him on that. Just on the, I mean, all countries suffered to greater or lesser extent, but Germany was one of the countries where they went full on jackboot. But God forbid that you mention the war.
Yeah, suppression of free thinking is a.
Well, this is exactly what they did. This is why I can see elements of what happened over the last few years happening, because there were things like the censorship, the propaganda, the labels that were put onto people who didn't actually toe the line. I mean, you were cancelled. It's exactly what's happening now.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, as it was almost like all these the media platforms that people can get cancelled from, YouTube, Facebook, all the rest of it. There seem to be, I can't really keep up with the latest ones, especially the newer ones that are supposedly more freedom oriented that people are moving to. I don't have enough time in my life to shift all of my content from one platform to another, which is why I've got my own website where, that's the hub for everything. That, of course, can be shut down, but, it gives you a lot more autonomy and control. But for a lot of these platforms, it was almost like in some sort of long game over many years that so much of all of our culture and our consciousness was drawn into these arenas, then kind of for some kind of trap to be sprung. That's what it feels like sometimes. You become dependent on something. It's just like a drug dealer or something. Like a pimp keeping his whores on heroin or something to control them. And he can use that to manipulate them to do what he wants. If that sounds seedy, it's meant to be. So a lot of people were kind of slaves to these systems, but at the same time as we reel against them.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think many people now, it seems to me, because I'm somebody, I like to sort of look at the comment sections of newspapers and just see, what the general consensus of the general public is. And I've noticed a massive change in the general public and their opinions on what's going on with everything. And it seems to me that there are a lot more people now that are very mistrustful of the mainstream media and actually asking questions, which of course is a good thing.
Well, they shot themselves in the foot in many ways. Again, we did see this in the wake of 9/11. Lots of historical periods this has happened in, but I think 9/11 is the closest correlate really to what happened with the pandemic. They're crying wolf. We know how that story ends. And you can also see how people's trust in medicine, and in things like vaccines, for example, many of which have been developed over the years and worked very effectively, but people's trust has been, severely undermined because of how things were handled, and it's very difficult to undo that harm, So, what did they think was going to happen, So, and crying wolf over the terrorists under every bed after 9/11, crying wolf over climate. Look, the climate changes. I'm not saying humans have no role in that. It makes sense to me that we would. But the point is, there's been this constant doom mongering, predictions about how everything's going to be, how disastrous the future is going to be. And it doesn't turn out like that. And in the pandemic, we saw the same thing. And then we're told that, politicians and policymakers had to be conservative. They had to think worst case scenario just in case. But some of it was beyond absurd, and anybody, whether qualified or not, could see that.
Well, you had the ozone, didn't you? You had your hole in the ozone. You had in the 70s we were going to freeze over, within a couple of years or whatever. And then it's too hot, too cold. It's but people will mistrust it, obviously, in time,
Yeah, and even if, let's just say that there's a famous graphic, I made my own version of it, that shows two covers from Time magazine, one from some point in the 70s, which was basically like prepare for the new ice age. Yeah. And then there was another one from about 10, 15 years ago, basically prepare for the exact opposite. Earth is going to be an inferno. Even if these headline writers and these story writers were working on what at the time could be judged as sound information, what did they think was going to happen if they do an about face? I said earlier, fine, change your mind, new information. But when this happens and the time between those incidents is much less, as we saw the pandemic, people contradicting themselves, for better or worse, no matter whose side you're on, if you're on anybody's, then what do you think is going to happen to the public mind? They're going to get bamboozled, you know, and they're going to just say, all right, enough of that. I'm not going to pay any attention to it. I think that's certainly where we are with the media.
I mean, we were being told through the media, say, oh, well, you know, the hospital's a chock-a-block with people, and you can't. And when we went down there, it was absolutely empty. Our hospital, you know, they're supposed to be wards and wards of COVID people, but we saw empty hospitals, didn't we, when we went there? So I don't know. And then you got all the nurses dancing in these videos, which was quite upsetting to people, really, if they've lost a loved one. I mean, you know, absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, at the very least, that was in bad taste. I mean, if they were dancing around when they were apparently worked to the point of breakdown, what, you know, would anybody? Let's rewind a few years before, or just a few months before all that started, and you had people in hospitals for all the usual sorts of reasons, accidents, illness, you know. Some people popping in for a day, some people there maybe never leave, you know, because they'll pass away. Why weren't doctors and nurses doing dance routines then? You know, why wasn't there a dance routine in the cancer ward, dance routine in intensive care? What was it about the pandemic that suddenly prompted people to do very well choreographed, actually, for amateurs, dance routines?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you know, having done a little bit of dance and things myself and routines, you know, it does take time to rehearse these things.
They were beautifully choreographed.
They were. It doesn't take 5 minutes, I can tell you that.
No, exactly. So that was just bizarre. But again, there was a whole dimension to all of that went, you know, and I've looked into this a lot because I'm interested in metaphysics and, you know, paranormal and that which lies beyond our senses, you know, the deeper, wider reality. There was all sorts of aspects of what happened during that time that smacked of like spiritual warfare or something. You know, there was a whole other, but even in practical terms, you talked about visiting a hospital for whatever reason and it not being overrun. I made another one of my video diaries was COVID-19, where exactly is the pandemic? And even though I pointed out that we couldn't travel much at that time, certainly just walking into a hospital was, you know, strongly discouraged. You couldn't just do that. And if you went in there with a camera, for example, you get into trouble very quickly. But I said in the video, based just on my own 5 senses, you know, what I could see around me, forget the TV, not watching that, not listening to the news, not going online to, you know, fear-mongering websites, but just my own 5 senses, moving around it to whatever extent I could. At no time did I see any actual evidence for a pandemic. And I'm talking about the definition of pandemic here, not some people being ill or coughing. That's not a pandemic per se. And I just thought it was interesting. And people said, oh, you're denying there's a pandemic. I said, I'm not. What I'm saying is that to me, you know, metaphysically, it is interesting that I saw no evidence for it, and a lot of other people didn't as well. The pandemic, whether it was physically real or not, or whether that definition was justified, for most people, it existed on TV and online. That's where it was. If you wanted to view the pandemic, you had to turn your TV on.
That's right. Exactly. I mean, that's the thing, you know, the television and obviously social media also played a massive part in that as well. And it's all, you know, this constant propaganda, you know, it was sort of every tea time, you know, Boris would come on the television, you know, with another statement about everything and everyone was glued to what's he going to say now, you know, and it was this, you were trapped in this constant fear state all the time of, oh my goodness, you know, what's going to happen now?
Mass graves, wasn't it? There was mass graves.
There was all sorts of things, and it was all really pushing a fear-based narrative, wasn't it?
Yeah, and there was pop-up hospitals that they had, a lot of which were never used. I'm not sure if any of them were ever used because they just weren't needed. But yeah, that was very curious. But again, it was like, to go back to 1984, it was like, you know, you're turning on your telly screen to find out what reality is. And then you're having that, I can't remember how many minutes it was in 1984. You had the 2-minute hate or the 4-minute hate, whatever it was, where you could just rage against your enemies, you know, who oftentimes were your neighbors. And you saw that with the people being turned against each other. I mean, it was really sad to see during that time. And by the way, listeners, viewers, we're not just going to talk about the pandemic for an hour and 45, but this is just where it's a free-flowing conversation, as you mentioned. We're just going where it goes. But it was so sad to see families being torn apart, relationships suffering, children turned against parents and vice versa, work colleagues falling out, just relationships that were destroyed. I'm not just talking about by social distancing and lack of ability to socialize.
Exactly, it is a divide and conquer.
Classic divide and conquer tactics, isn't it?
Yeah, and you saw that really throughout that time, and it was horrible. I remember the whole pot banging farce that we had in this country. I'm not sure if there's anything similar in other countries, but I can remember clearly being at the supermarket. God, that was like going into a war zone. But being in the supermarket with my girlfriend, buying some groceries, walking back through the open area to back home, and there being some apartments somewhere. It just so happened that we were walking underneath there when the whatever it was called, the 2-minute pot banging was taking place for the NHS. Where the hell did that even, but I just remember these 2 or 3 people hanging out of this window, and we were walking past, clearly not taking part because we weren't even home at that point, and just leaning out of the window and banging really aggressively and looking at us with full of hate. You get inside.
Why aren't you banging it?
Because it's full of pasta, that's why.
But
it's just a whole thing. You think about that, it's just, as I said, it's very reminiscent of Nazi Germany. And I know that Hitler's chief architect, Albert Speer, told the Nuremberg Tribunal that what distinguished the Third Reich from all previous dictatorships was its use of all the means of communication to sustain itself and to deprive its objects of the power of independent thought, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and all of that being done, propaganda is nothing new, but all of that, but it really came into its own in the 20th century. But all of that being done before 24/7 global communications, the like of which we have now. We spoke earlier about the disruptive and also enabling power of the internet, but now it's just off the charts. People like the Nazis or Edward Bernays, father of advertising stroke propaganda, they could only dream of the sort of power available now to reach people almost everywhere. Oh, it's worth remembering though, when we have these sorts of conversations, that there are still many, many millions of people, I'm not sure what sort of percentage we're looking at, who do not have access to television and the internet, who are not getting this stuff shoved down their throat day in, day out. But still, it's a dwindling proportion of the global population.
That's for sure. Kevin says, was it Nixon who said people won't believe it until they see it on TV? Yeah.
Exactly. It's rather like that. People now, rather than, if you want to know what the weather is going to do, all right, weather forecast is useful. That's looking ahead by meteorologists. But for a lot of people, I've seen them looking at their weather app on their device, and it's like raining outside, and they're going like, no, this is wrong. There's a little sun on my phone. It's not supposed to be raining. Why is it raining?
I think, to be honest with you, it's more accurate the old-fashioned way to cast the seaweed.
Yeah, absolutely. Not like Michael Fish.
I think that's the thing always used to make me laugh. I said to Gary that, we have all this supposed technology about, predicting the weather and everything else. Yeah. And yet they seem to be more accurate during World War II than they are now.
Well, yeah, there is one thing we're suffering from we benefited tremendously from technology. Again, technology, you can go back to, hunter-gatherers, the earliest humans, anything that they did with their hands, to cut stone or to make bows and arrows or, to cook food, it was all technology. But in the modern era, what we think of as technology, so let's just say from the Industrial Revolution onward, we benefit tremendously from that. We have lives, it's starting to decline now, but certainly our generation and our parents and grandparents enjoyed lives immeasurably better in terms of material comfort than their predecessors did. But what we're seeing now, and you see this in terms of technological fixes for everything, I'm going to recommend another writer, an American writer, John Michael Greer. He writes about the fate of industrial civilization, amongst many other things, including the occult. But I've had him on the show many times, and he talks about diminishing returns from technology, that technological innovation has slowed dramatically. Radically new ideas coming out are getting thinner on the ground. And we're getting more and more complex technological gadgetry, like, phones and tablets getting more and more complex, but delivering less bang for the buck, and also developing problems. And when we have a technological problem in some area of society, the tendency is to look to technology to solve that problem. So we add another layer of technology on top, and we sometimes end up with this really Byzantine, complex, just Kafkaesque technological nightmare that really, as you say, if you completely just threw that away and looked out the window and say, okay, I can see what the weather is locally, that's what matters. And there's all these other ways of doing things that were improved upon, but arguably you can say, actually, we're not seeing that improvement anymore. We've gone beyond the improvement into actual detriment now. Like, what is the cost of this technology?
That's right. It's a bit like with cars, isn't it? I mean, cars have become so much more technologically advanced with all the different things that they can do. But of course, with that comes a huge amount of problems potentially as well, and expense.
Yeah, well, I'm old enough to remember. I remember the very first car I bought. I took it out for a test drive. This was like in 1989, and the guy let me go my own, which is kind of unheard of now. So I just took the car out. He was a family friend, and halfway up a hill, it just conked out. And I was like, oh, okay, this is not a good sign. So there happened to be a truck passing on the way back to town. So I got a lift back in, went to the car sales place, and said to the guy, oh, look, the car broke down. So he drove me back up there again, up the hill to where the car was. He popped the bonnet, and he had just steam cleaned the engine to make it look nice for the buyer, in this case me. So he just popped the distributor cap off, and there was water from the steam cleaner had got in there. So he just wiped it with a cloth, put it back on, and the car started. That's all it was. Now it would be like, okay, we're going to need a diagnostic computer, and we've got no idea what's going on with this thing,
Well, I went on to that artificial intelligence thing. And you asked it a question, it gets it wrong, and you think, how the hell is that going to replace the human being, honestly? And, it's absolutely ridiculous. And you think that I say to people, well, the artificial intelligence is man-made, isn't it? It's all man-made. I mean, nothing works on its own. And to think that one day it might have its very own soul is...
Yeah, I mean, we're really barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah.
I don't think there is actually a right tree in this respect. With artificial intelligence, because as you say, it's man-made, woman-made, or I, we, it, thing-made, whatever the hell the latest one is. But we got a saying. I remember learning very early on in computer studies at school. This thing called GIGO, GIGO, and it stands for garbage in, garbage out. So you would know people were starting to think. I think influenced by science fiction. In the early days of computers, and people were led to believe, particularly as personal computers became available and more affordable, that the computer somehow was a sentient thing that had answers, that could do something that humans really couldn't do. Whereas all the computers can really do that we can't do very well is compute crunch numbers very quickly. They're very, very powerful at doing maths, crunching numbers, and also accessing information. So your computer can scan, an internet's worth of information in just milliseconds. Whereas if you go to a library, you're looking through books for information, you could be there for weeks and months. So there's certain things it's good at, but the idea that it was somehow had its own level of wisdom above ours. GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. What you put in comes out the other end. And so if, like I said about scientists being human beings as well and subjective, there's a number of science fiction films with supercomputers gone rogue. In fact, I just happen to have a book here, one such story coincidentally sitting next here, Colossus. Let's see if we can get a clear clear picture. That was made into a film. But yeah, this is a computer that goes rogue. It's a bit like Skynet in the Terminator in that sense. And there's other films where computers have kind of had digital dementia. They kind of gone insane, you know, and it was ultimately because it was human beings, you know, it was our consciousness that was fed into it, you know. And so that's what we're up to with that. And I think that the whole transhumanist and artificial intelligence thing really just misunderstand consciousness.
What do you
as
think,
human
Greg,
beings,
that we'll ever see the day when you say to AI, you know, something, and they say, "Oh, you've hurt my feelings"?
Yeah, I very much doubt that, because you know, if you look at what the whole thing with AI, and we look at, say, rewind in science fiction again, look at a character like, say, Mr. Spock in Star Trek. He was really, well, was he proud? Because he would claim not to have those sorts of emotions, but he certainly saw it as a benefit that he wasn't emotional, and that, you know, you couldn't offend him because it wasn't logical, blah, blah, blah. So if we follow that logical route, then no, you know, AI would not be like that, because there would be no advantage in it. You know, quite the contrary, you see it as a disadvantage. And human beings, we sometimes cultivate that, you know, resistance to things that other people get very discombobulated by. You know, we try not to be too reactive. You know, we try not to have our buttons pushed too easily, because it means we can be manipulated. Again, we see what's happening with the media. So we cultivate a little bit of Mr. Spock as well, to just say, well, you can call me anything you like, but I'm not going to react to it. You're not going to be able to provoke me. You're not going to be able to manipulate me. I'm going to be a little bit sort of computer-like on this one, you know.
It's very, very interesting, though. But, you know, I mean, I was listening to the radio and there was these scientists on there talking about AI, and they say, oh, you know, that it'll have its own consciousness soon and its own feelings. And I thought, what the hell are you on about? What the hell are you on about? But people will be believing this, you know. It's just crazy.
Why? Yeah, again, it's a misunderstanding of what consciousness is. And by the way, almost everything that we think we understand about that is a misunderstanding, or just a lack of understanding. We don't know what consciousness is as such. We know that a form, we postulate that it exists because of our awareness, and that's what consciousness is. It is consciousness that is aware. We see what I mean? So that's about as far as we've got really with that. And there's lots of interesting developments around this related to quantum physics, and lots of it also relates to spiritual traditions and where those two areas overlap. But them saying that it will develop its consciousness, you know, AI will develop, I mean, spontaneously just pop out of nowhere. This is like saying that one day they're going to create life. We don't know how life started, so we're not, you know, we don't have a very strong basis on which to work. You know, those experiments that were conducted many moons ago, oh well, they created life, or, you know, we can see how life could be created in a lab. We get this primordial soup, and then, I don't know, lightning strikes it or something, and, you know, what they did was create, I can't remember the word I'm looking for exactly, but it was kind of some kind of biological material that's part of a building block for life, but that wasn't creating life. So we don't know how life started. We don't really know what it is, and we certainly don't know what consciousness is. So talking about those two major you know, concepts in terms of like boxes of metal and wires, to me is like, you know, apples and oranges. It makes no sense.
No, it doesn't. I mean, to me, from looking at it, a consciousness from a spiritual perspective, to me, consciousness is to be aware of the divine, and the divine in everything, and including yourself.
Yeah, it's that okay, basic awareness. We know that we know, if you see what I mean. We're aware, you know, we have our I think therefore I am type idea. You know, we have this awareness that, and that's also very closely related, you're right, to this idea of there being something other. So that sense that we have of the ineffable, and the sense of there being something beyond our five senses and beyond three dimensions, I think is related to that. Definitely, that's where that comes from. That's what religions have been trying to interpret. That's what spiritual traditions tell us, you know, and that's a lot of what we use, particularly in the modern era. We kind of suppress those thoughts and urges with materialism as, you know, in science and a worldview, but also as a way of life, just buying stuff, you know, but we find at particular times in our life that all of that suddenly doesn't matter. For most people, it's usually as they're facing death. You know, if you have time to contemplate your death, By that I mean if you're not just run over by a bus. If you get very old or infirm or ill, and you start to realize, hey, look, I'm on the way out. Suddenly, all of the materialistic stuff ceases to matter,
Absolutely.
and you start thinking about these other things. So, but those are things those are open to us all of our life, and if we paid more attention to that, I think we'd be a lot better off. I spend a lot of time thinking about death. That is to say, just the passing of this, this bodily
for sure.
form, and what exists outside of that.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, as well? Because, I mean, this is something Gary and I discuss quite a lot as well, that over the years, what it appears that the controllers or the elite or whoever you want to call it, the cabal, have tried to do is they've tried to take the spiritual out of everything. They've tried to make absolutely everything materialistic. It's all material. So they don't want people to connect with the divine, but that is the truth. We all have the divine within us and everything in nature.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you find you're right about that. That's part of the materialist paradigm, the worldview. But you have religions there to kind of soak up a lot of that desire and a lot of that yearning in people. It's really just a way of defusing that, really, because religions of the mainstream ones have certainly long since lost touch with the ineffable, the divine, or any real access to it, or any meaningful way of giving the followers, believers, access to that. We have that access all the time, by the way, of course, but like everything else, it has to be channeled. But yeah, so you have this denial of anything beyond the five senses and beyond three dimensions in this very materialist world that most of us live in. But yet you have this curious phenomenon of, you talked about elites, and I don't like that word particularly because it implies we're setting people above us before we even start. But look at some of you can get into some really interesting, bizarre territory when you start looking into, let's just stick with elite, okay, for want of a better word. Elite use, belief in powers beyond the five senses, beyond three dimensions, and the use of them, whether it's in their personal life or not. I mean, how many secret societies and things like Bohemian Grove have we read about over the decades? And whether these are supposedly men's clubs or social clubs or networking or whatever it is, not all of it is purely symbolic. So what is all that about? And if you start, when you read some authors in the occult arena, in the esoteric, and it doesn't take very long for you to start reading about famous figures, world leaders. I mean, Ronald Reagan had his own astrologer, for example. But these people understanding very clearly that there are powers out there and beyond what we understand, that can be, how can I put it, that can affect human affairs, let's put it that way, and that you can use. This is the origin of magic, really. It's the idea that there are currents of energy beyond what we normally perceive that we can tune into and channel.
Yeah.
And I think it's like it's the manipulation of the soul power, isn't it? I mean, these elite, if you want to call them elite, these elite clubs, that they got sort of some control over the magic that they use or whatever. But as I say, that's just basically to take the power away from everybody else, because there isn't a single person in the world who doesn't have the sixth sense or doesn't have powers to heal with their hands, but they don't know that, of course. So therefore, if they don't know it, they don't realize it. But when you're talking about these satanic worship and all this kind of stuff, it really is. I don't know. It's working with a dark side of energy. But the simple fact of it is that you can't have one without the other. In nature, you look at nature and you look at the fox, how it of everything, isn't it? So as well as being a good side and a light side, there's also a dark side. It's obvious, isn't it?
Well, I don't know if listeners and viewers experienced that, by the way, Gary, but I lost some of your audio there for about 10 seconds. But anyway, most recent interview I've done, we're speaking now on the 30th of June, 2023. The most recent interview I posted at legalisefreedom.com is with Thomas Sheridan and Neil MacDonald. Again, two people I've interviewed on a number of occasions. Thomas and I go back many years. But in that, we're talking about, amongst other things, witchcraft trials of centuries gone by. And Thomas points out that, probably going back through thousands of years, I mean, maybe even, as far back in human history as we can go, but certainly particularly then, and we see the modern kind of technological version of it now, that those at the top have an absolute terror of us understanding our own power and understanding the energies, in Earth and the consciousness that can be tapped into and used for good or ill, but absolute terror of the great unwashed, the plebs and the peasants, using that because it's available to all, or whatever your social standing.
Exactly, for sure. And I think it's very interesting, isn't it, that we have certainly in the psychic field, we have professional skeptics. They're basically there to debunk everything. So, you'll have somebody on, a medium or a clairvoyant, come on, give some wonderful evidence, and then you immediately have the professional skeptic like Chris French or Richard Wiseman coming on to immediately debunk it and try to rationalize it in inverted commas.
Steve Donnelly,
and say, well, it's just a combination of cold reading and this and that, when the reality is that every single person on the planet, and animals, if you don't mind, actually have this thing called the sixth sense, for want of a better term.
Well, a lot of these people really are what we call now call pseudo-skeptics. They like to use the word pseudoscience, but a lot of these people are pseudo-skeptics. They're not really skeptical. There's a phrase I developed a few years ago, and it is, if we, not to say we as in you guys or me necessarily, but if one chooses to oppose the religious, one must be careful not to become too religious in one's opposition. So don't turn into a raving fundamentalist because you're opposed to raving fundamentalists. But that's, a lot of so-called skeptics don't really see that that's what they become.
For sure.
It's like burn the witch, and we saw that during COVID. We see that now with all sorts of debates going on in the world. And Richard Dawkins, I'm pleased to say, his stock seems to have fallen somewhat. He's got some interesting ideas, but he's fundamentally wrong about the big questions, in my opinion. And people like him now do sound, again, you don't hear him shouting, or people like him shouting quite as loudly as they used to. But you look at some of those ideas now, and they've got less of a spring in their step, which is a good thing. They're just not as arrogantly confident that they're right and you're all idiots as they used to be. And that reflects a gradually changing landscape in science and consciousness in general.
Do you remember, Greg, when James Randi had $1 million? He had $1 million paranormal challenge, didn't he? If you could prove that you had any kind of ability of any sort, you'd get $1 million. So I challenged him, and he wrote back to me and he said, if you can do what you say you can do, you're a miracle worker. And if not, you're a deluded person. But then shortly after that, they took the $1 million away. So I don't know why that was, but anyway.
Well, I mean, if you look at the work of someone like Dean Radin, who's been on my show, where, parapsychological investigator using rigorously scientific methods, there's lots of evidence for this. That falls into what are normally considered scientific standards, in these sorts of experiments, in terms of how likely these things are. Basically, occurrences happening well beyond what you'd expect them to if it was purely random. I can't remember the exact scientific term, but there's stacks of evidence, and it increases to mount up. It's just a question of people not looking at it, really, refusing to look at it. It's just like, the priests not wanting to look through Galileo's telescope, because they probably knew in their heart of hearts what was in the other side of it.
Well, I think it comes down to that term conspiracy theory again, doesn't it? Because immediately when you say conspiracy theorist or conspiracy theory, the vast majority of the general public go, oh, well, I'm not going to listen to that. It's a conspiracy theory, because it's kind of this blanket term now for anything that's apart from the mainstream narrative. So it's a deliberately loaded statement to turn people off, isn't it?
Oh yeah, and it was conceived as such. I mean, it was originally came into popular parlance after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and it was used against to smear people who questioned the events of that day.
Yeah.
Simple as. But again, it's another term, I'm pleased to say, that has got a bit less currency than it did even a couple of years ago, because so many people who were labeled as conspiracy theorists turn out to be just normal, rational people who just had ideas contrary to the mainstream narrative. And that term was being applied to people that aren't just loons, just coming up with provably crazy theories, like flat Earth, for example. Whatever you think about that, I think it's easily proven that it's not in the same category at all. You were talking about during the pandemic period, eminently qualified people saying, I disagree with the mainstream narrative of the way this is being done. I disagree with how this is being handled. I'm qualified to disagree. And they were just being labeled as conspiracy theorists. So again, it's another form of crying wolf, and there's a cost attached with that. So I see conspiracy theorists being bandied around a lot less now. It's not the cheap and easy way to rubbish someone's reputation as it used to be.
Well, many people lost their jobs and their careers for speaking out, didn't they? Which is extremely sad. And also the shadow banning which you get on Facebook and other platforms like that, purely because you voice an opinion which is different from them, and it's totally wrong, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a sign of weakness, not being able to tolerate opposition or alternative ideas, because let ideas stand and fall on their own. If something's provably rubbish, then it'll become self-evident.
Sure.
It's like a lot of the things that have been said by the mainstream, in terms of some of the stories that we've been talking about. They've fallen by the wayside because they turned out to be rubbish. So if somebody else comes out and said the Earth is flat and here's why, well, let that stand or fall on its own. I'm not wanting to shut flat earthers up, for example. Do what you want. Just don't hurt anyone else. But if your ideas turn out to be rubbish, then just have the good grace to say, okay, I was wrong, and move on.
Exactly. And it's the old adage again, truth doesn't mind being questioned, does it?
No, that's the other thing. That's a thing to look out for, isn't it? Particularly if the questions that you can't ask are the questions that should be asked the most urgently need to be addressed. If you're told that something's off the table, then that's a red flag.
That's
exactly. An alarm bell straight away.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's interesting, isn't it, how our governments basically utilize psychology. They use it all the time to manipulate people. I mean, propaganda is just one way of doing that, but they're using psychology all the time to kind of shape and mold people's ideas and opinions on things.
Oh yeah, it's just a huge thing. We talked about Edward Bernays, and the development of propaganda stroke advertising. That's what that's all about. There's a reason why people go. There's a reason why people go to supermarkets and buy Cheerios or whatever it happens to be. Is they've been told that that's what they want.
Yeah,
and it's penetrated their subconscious, and then they come to believe that that those ideas are their own. Most people are running around, if they have any ideas at all, parroting stuff, and they think it's come from themselves. There's people sitting in pubs here right tonight in the UK on Friday night, saying, well, I think this and I think that, and this is what we need to do. And they heard it maybe half an hour earlier on the television,
Exactly. Yeah, it's just repeating parrot fashion. The little seeds are planted in people's heads, and then off they go.
It's just mind control, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think it's no coincidence, as I said. So, I mean, for example, during the pandemic periods, we had Professor Susan Michie of SAGE, which is, for the American audience, is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. Now, interestingly enough, as well as being a member of the Communist Party for over 40 years in Britain. She was also made the chair of WHO's Technical Advisory Group on Behavioural Insights and Sciences. Now, she is a behaviour scientist whose specialist field is how to manipulate human behaviour. So I feel that there's no coincidence that we have people like that sitting on these advisory committees.
No, not at all. And another, again, British reference that folks overseas may not have heard of is they had this nicknamed the Nudge Unit in the UK government during the pandemic period. And this was nudge, it was more like shove, but it was about how to get people to be afraid and how to get them to act accordingly with regards to the perceived pandemic threat. And that was all about, neuro-linguistic programming and, subliminals and, psyops, basically, as it's known in the community, psychological operations. That went into overdrive after 9/11. And this is why I made another video diary I made at the time it was called COVID 9/11, a warning from history. And I was just drawing parallels between the two situations. And we have, unfortunately, I don't think we've heard the last of this. Expected to be a new version of this, possibly around climate, possibly around the economic system. So climate, as I say, lockdowns for the environment, or the economic system implosion of that. We need to have this digital currency. So, and I expect to see similar propaganda and manipulation and psyops around all of that in future.
Well, talking about the Twin Towers and that, it's I found it quite difficult to get my head around the fact that when buildings come down, like exactly the same as if they've been demolished, and then you get another building, which I think was building 7, that comes down, and if you see a bird strike a plane, a nozzle, and it just makes a great big dent in it, and you're thinking, well, how the hell would a plane, go into a building and cause that destruction? I mean, it's absolutely farcical, but I mean, they got away with it, didn't they, for so long? I mean, it's all going to come out soon, but for now, they've got away with it for so long, and people absolutely believed it. I can't understand.
My take on that was, at the time, again, it was very similar to the pandemic, as I mentioned, but I remember getting up in the morning of 9/11, and of course, it was, I think, about being in the UK with the time difference. I think it was lunchtime, early afternoon when it actually occurred. But I remember having the television on. I was eating my lunch, actually, and I just put the news on. I still did that back then. And again, for about a week, or whatever, I was taking, oh my God, look at what's happened. This is going to mean bad things. Whatever comes of this, it's going to be bad. And I remember being worried about sort of, what is this going to mean, like a world war? Or, the US are going to react to this. They're not going to wait. They're just going to react. But it wasn't very long after the events that I started to just think, this doesn't sit quite right. There's something else going on here. Certainly when the BBC announced, for example, that Building 7 had fallen, the presenters on screen with Building 7 behind her on live TV, why is she saying that? And for me, the most mysterious episode was the Pentagon.
Exactly.
But again, what I say this about the pandemic, and I'll say it about 9/11 as well, and about moon landings and any of the other things that people lump in the conspiracy realm. Whatever you think about it, all that I and many others are saying is that we don't feel that we've had the whole story, and that some elements of it, if not most, don't add up.
Exactly.
But again, it has to be black or white, as mentioned earlier. We're not allowed to say, well, this part of it, that seems logical. I can see how that could happen, but this other thing, I'm not happy with that at all. You're not allowed to do that. So either are you fully on board with the mainstream version, or are you out there saying the whole thing's a lie? There's no ground in between.
I mean, this is part of, psychological operations by security forces, though, isn't it? Because they'll put little seeds of truth in, but lumped in amongst that is a load of old rubbish that they're disseminating as well. So, of course, people in the end go, I don't believe any of it.
Well, there's a saying, the best lies are partly true. And that's, if you want to, I'm not saying we're not advocating lying here, but if you for some reason you decided you needed to tell an untruth, if you can make it plausible by being partly true, that's more likely to fly. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Sorry for the
exactly.
9/11 reference. But this is, and I don't know if you're talking about seeds of truth and blah, blah, blah. This is partly magical as well. When there's a thing in magic where if you're almost like this would come into the realm of what they would call black magic, but if you were going to curse someone or hex someone, you have to tell them that they're doing it without them realizing that you're telling them. This can make it very powerful, and you'll see that sometimes hidden in plain sight in the metaphysical and magical dimension of the media sphere of world events. You know, we're being told that this is what, but we can't just quite see it that way. You know, but the manipulators and the propagandists have to include this into their spell casting. You know, they have to tell us what they're doing to us, but in a way that most people can't decode.
Exactly, and mostly you see this in the movies, don't you? So there's a lot of that.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I mean, movies are such a rich resource for, like, you know, interpreting our reality, and so many things. I'm doing a whole series at the minute of vlogs, you know, videos mostly on YouTube, but the links to them are at legalisefreedom.com as well. And I've only just started recently. It's called Hauntology and Dystopia, and it's all about movies and TV shows from the past, mostly 60s, 70s, and 80s, and just exploring those for the, you know, amazing, interesting cultural artifacts that they are. But the threads that I've been able to draw out have surprised even myself. The predictive programming, the future events that were laid out in the past before saying this could happen, this has happened. So much science fiction becomes fact. It's incredible. And, you know, have we been telling ourselves, even if it's not at the hands of manipulators and propagandists, as a species, have we somehow known about the trajectory of our civilization? And sort of this has been coming out through fiction and culture, because it's one way to deal with these difficult issues is to fictionalize it. You know, it's not really real. You know, it's just a story.
Exactly. Well, if you can hold that thought just for a moment, because I'd just like to say, if you're just joining us, you're listening to the Allens Investigate, and we're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans, and also on Roku. So, yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, Eyes Wide Shut was a really interesting one, and I think that you've just done an article on that. I seem to recall having a quick read through that. Now, that's a particular interest to me because I was actually in Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh, really? That's interesting. So I saw it once. I remember I was in a hotel in Iceland. I was there for work reasons, actually, as a music journalist. They have this annual music festival because it's such a small country. There's only like 200,000 people, less actually. I think the city I live in is more people in it than Iceland. But the government do a lot to promote Icelandic music. So they invite journalists. It's a good trip, actually. They invite journalists from all around Europe to go to Iceland, all expenses paid, and then to go home and write stories about their bands. So I've been there 3 times for that. Seen the Northern Lights too. It was really cool.
Brilliant.
Yeah, but the first night I was there, I was in the hotel, and the only thing there was some stuff in English, but a lot of Icelandic. The only thing I could find that I wanted to look at was Eyes Wide Shut in English. So I watched the film in my hotel room, and I've seen it just that once. But I think you were referring to it. I didn't quite catch what you're saying, but I just did an interview about Stanley Kubrick with Jason Horsley, an audio interview. But I've turned that part of that into an article, which I've just posted on the website.
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about that I saw. I just read it briefly today. I just thought it's very interesting because there was, quite a lot of symbolism in that movie. And I'm interested to know your thoughts about Stanley Kubrick, because some say, well, he was giving us a warning about, what was to come, because there's many things in all of his movies. I think The Shining was an interesting one as well, because you've got the Apollo on the kid's jumper, haven't you? On all these various things. He was definitely trying to get something out, but was he doing it to make people aware, or do you think he was one of them?
Well, personally, I don't have a strong view on that because I haven't done sufficient research. I took his films at face value, which I think is the appropriate way to come to it if you don't already have, strong ideas about it, about his work. So I would simply, if people listening to this are interested in an alternative view, I'd refer them to Jason Horsley's book, The Kubrickon, which just recently been published, and to our interview together, because he believes that Kubrick is part of basically some kind of an agenda, some kind of sinister focus group aimed at not only manipulating human consciousness, but the inception of artificial intelligence and the eventual replacement of humans. So that's a pretty big claim to make.
Yeah.
So
I personally don't think he's wrong on that, but that's just my opinion. Yeah, it's interesting.
I think a lot of popular culture exists, to manipulate in that way, if not predictive programming, then certainly as a distraction. The worst of popular culture is certainly like that. Most of what's on television sets now is just utter bilge. It hurts me. It hurts me mentally. If I turn on the television, I do have one. If I turn it on to go to the food channel to watch a cookery show, which I consider to be fairly low on propaganda and relatively non-violent, unless Gordon Ramsay's involved, then sometimes you pass by other stuff, going through a couple of channels, and
some of it, Love Island, do you?
Oh, Celebrity Love Island on Ice, or whatever the current thing is,
Oh Lord.
But it's quite moronic, to be honest, isn't it? Most of the stuff. And I don't mean any disrespect, but I personally find most of it quite moronic.
Oh, I mean, it's not a matter of respect, or otherwise it just is.
It's chewing gum for the brain, isn't it?
Yeah, we can all enjoy something that's relatively vacuous, that doesn't tax our consciousness at all. I mean, I like some of the cartoons that are aimed at adults. That's to say, not adult cartoons as in 18 plus, but they're not suitable for children because of the language and the themes. I enjoy some of that. If you require just like switch your mind off for a little while and just decompress.
Well, it's interesting because it's interesting because the Simpsons do a lot of predictive programming, don't they? They get a lot of things right that come true in the future. So
yeah, I've not looked at any systematic study of it, but I've seen so many screenshots and memes that if they turn out to be accurate, you go back to the original episodes of The Simpsons, not just general trends like a domed city, for example, but actual events. And with numbers and people and places involved, it's quite creepy, very, very interesting, But I noticed the light levels falling on my camera feed, so I'm just going to lean around here and move the lamp a little bit because I don't have advanced studio technology.
You still look fine from where we are.
Right, I think that's sort of created a weird light underneath me, but okay, hang on. It's all very high tech. Is that any better? No, that's worse.
Oh.
For our listeners, there's lots of things going on at the moment.
Okay, well, if I can still be seen, then we'll just go with that.
Well, you look fine, Greg. Yeah. We can see you fine. Yes, I mean, it's very interesting. So, I mean, this propaganda thing, I mean, it's sort of going through everything. And I think you mentioned Edward Bernays earlier on as well in the program. And I mean, he famously said propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government.
Yeah, exactly. Government couldn't really function without propaganda. It's information dissemination, but with the added layer of psychological manipulation. It's emotional manipulation. Again, that's why advertising and political propaganda or any other sort of propaganda really are sort of one and the same. As I mentioned earlier about advertising for breakfast cereal, advertising for a political party, or advertising for any type of system, economic, political, cultural, anything at all. That messaging, and of course there are, you understand why people do this. If you've got widgets that you want to sell or breakfast cereal, you're going to talk about what you consider to be appealing aspects of your product. Okay, that's not disingenuous or dishonest. I promote what I do, you guys promote what you do by saying what it is and saying, we think it's pretty cool, check it out, you can find it here, and maybe sometimes you might think, oh, well, add an extra layer to that, also, however you would do that, just sex it up a little bit. But that's a fine line between that and playing on people's emotions. You know, that like in sales, for example, there's FOMO, FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah,
you know, playing on people's, well, other people are getting this and there's only 500 left. You know, what are you going to do about it?
That's
you know?
right. For sure. I mean, I think that, you know, it's no sort of coincidence, therefore, that the CIA then started using this method of imprinting ideas and opinion formulating and everything else with their Operation Mockingbird, which was a large-scale program which was started sort of in the early years of the Cold War. And the idea was to attempt to manipulate the domestic American news media organizations for propaganda purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, now my phone's ringing. What did I say to myself earlier on? Take the phone off the hook. Chat amongst yourselves. I'm going to take the phone off
the hook. Yeah,
so I think it is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, extremely interesting.
I mean, the thing is, as well, with Operation Mockingbird, I mean, it aimed to collect intelligence as well by bribing journalists and institutions around the world and affect public opinion by manipulating news media.
Well, it'd be good to see. The media change when it, you know, in this side of the Atlantic and America as well. All around the world, really. We need truth, don't we? We need to.
Well, we do, because I mean, very much you see this is still in operation, because you still see propaganda in action on our mainstream news channels. You see propaganda in action via the use of memes, even on social media, for example. So this is all very much still in operation. And I mean, William Casey, the CIA director, at his first staff meeting in 1981 said, "We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false."
It's quite sad, really.
And it's not just America, because it's all over the world, isn't it?
Yeah, and once, I know I've just come in at the end of what you're saying, but when you get people to accept or to believe what they know to be lies, then that generates cognitive dissonance. If people are to hold these opposing thoughts in their minds, it's very, very uncomfortable. So they have to find a way to, you know, either they reject the idea or they assimilate it, and basically, you know, they are living a lie, but they reconcile that within their own minds. It's not sustainable, but that creates enormous how can I put it? There's a psychological fallout from that when people know that there's manifest untruths that they're going along with. I mean, you saw that, for example, in Nazi Germany, and people knowing that what they were doing was wrong, but doing it anyway.
Yeah.
And they somehow, on some level, for some people, they had completely sort of brainwashed themselves, and only maybe a hypnotist could have got them to say, you know, put them under and got them to say, you know, the truth about, you know, what they really thought about what they were doing.
Yeah, and I think as well, you know, that many people, they don't really like to step off that comfortable spot, do they? That if the rest of the people around them are all saying something, they don't want to be different. They want to be the same. They want to fit in, and I think that's the vast majority. I don't personally. I like to be different anyway. That's just me. But I think, you know, a lot of people, and I think they did actually conduct some experiments years ago. And I remember, this is going back a long time now, and they had a class full of kids, and they were all in on this experiment apart from one kid. And they said, "What's 2 + 2?" And they're all putting their hand up and saying 5. "Oh, yes, 5, miss." And this one kid was going, no, it's 4. Anyway, he came to this one kid that wasn't in on it, and she said, you know, what's 2 + 2? And he sort of went, 5.
Yeah, that's right.
Because he didn't want to be different.
Yeah, well, there's enormous pressure around that. It's a tribal thing, really, of, like, you know, wanting to fit in, which in many ways can be a good thing, you know, because if you're, you know, certainly in our tribal past, outsiders could be very dangerous. You know, dissidents could be very dangerous. I don't mean people with different ideas, but people could actually be a threat to the the security and the integrity of the tribe. But that's very different now from having a different idea about something where if you're being part of the mass formation, you're actually a danger to yourself and others. And that's one thing you've noticed now, that people will do harm to themselves and to others just to maintain this, an imposed belief system from outside. They'll go along with it to their own detriment. You saw people having their businesses destroyed during the pandemic so they could go along with what they're being told to go along with. Oh, well, if my business is going to be wrecked, I'm going to lose my house and my wife's going to leave, it's for the greater good.
No,
it's terrible.
It's incredible. We use doctors and nurses going along with it, and they know it's not right. And at the end of the day, as you say, it can't sustain. You can live that lie, but sooner or later, it can't sustain. It's simple as that.
No, and ultimately, there's a reckoning. There's no getting away from it in the long run. You talked about, we were talking earlier on about how when you get close to death, or you have a chance to stare death in the face, that you can think about your life very differently. Any of these lies that people tell themselves or tell other people will all come back to bite them in the end of the day. An untruth is an untruth. And there's no escaping. Karma is real. However you interpret it, your actions have consequences, is just a better way to put it. And,
exactly. It's a bit like throwing a pebble in a pond. You're going to create ripples, and it's going to cause a reaction in the end, isn't it?
Yeah. In this life or the next. I talked about John Michael Greer earlier, one of my regular guests, and I recently done a talk with him, occult philosophy and the evolution of consciousness, or evolution of the cosmos. I can't quite be one and the same thing, really. But in the general occult philosophy, as it's known, the perennial wisdom, the Hermetic tradition, whatever name you give it, what the lives that we're living, the existence that we're having now, is just a very tiny little bubble in a much wider and deeper reality. And we talk about afterlife, for example, as if it's an afterthought. This life that we're having now is the main event. There might be something afterwards, there might not. It's really the other way around. This is just a tiny little blip of experience within this much larger reality, and within that larger reality, there's no escape from your actions. You'll pay for them, and this is why things like people paying for things that they've done in past lives, or benefiting from things, from personal development, work they've done on themselves in past lives. It's all this journey, the evolution of consciousness and our souls from one state to another state to another state. We've sort of, I know this is getting quite metaphysical now, but it seems to me that we have descended from a higher unified form into this, this crude, low energy form, in order to reascend, as it were. It's a journey on the way where we learn something. There's a reason we're doing it. There's a purpose behind it. And that's what, evolution of consciousness in our souls actually is. So this is just this one phase we're passing through right now. But don't think that, destiny and karma and will, in the occult terms, that you can escape any of that. It's not possible.
I'd like to get your... Sorry, Shona.
No, I was just going to say, well, I think that's the point of making everything materialistic, so people can do what the heck they want and think that there are no repercussions from it afterwards.
Yeah, well, again, when you understand that repercussions happen on other planes of existence, it makes you think twice about your crimes, if indeed your actions are of that nature.
Exactly. I'd like to get your thoughts, Greg, on a couple of things that's happened in my life, and one is quite interesting parallel between them, because one was that I had an horse dream, a race, and during this race I saw the number of the horse was number 4. I saw the name was Tedborough. It was 11-1. It was an 8-runner race, and it came from last to first and won in the dream. And the very next day when I got up, I got the Sun newspaper, and in the 2:30, number 4 was Tedborough. It was 11-1 in an 8-runner race, and sure enough, he won, right? So that was the very next day. And that's one example. And the other example is I was with 2 friends, and one of the friends I spoke to, I said, John, you've lived many lives before and died many violent deaths, but you won't in this one. And I turned to my friend Sheila And I said, I can't say the same for you. And Sheila went to bed. And when she went to bed, I kept getting fire with her. And 17 years later, she died in Grenfell Tower.
Okay, so I'm just scribbling a couple of things. Basically, if we look at if we talk about consciousness as fundamental, some kind of ground of being, so the universe is basically mental. Time and space are not fundamental. They're concepts that we've developed in order to make sense of the experience we're having here, but they're not kind of like a fundamental scaffolding of the universe. If you think about a conscious, infinite, in terms of time and space, it has no beginning, no end, it has no edge, mental reality, and all this material stuff that we think is fundamentals within that, including time and space, then it allows for all sorts of things happening outside of time and space.
Yeah,
so
very interesting.
Dreaming about the future, for example, because that future isn't actually in any fundamental way somewhere down the line in time. That's just your perception of it. So it's entirely possible that could happen. Interestingly, I'm just reading a book at the minute. It's a massive 2-volume book by the psychologist Ian McGilchrist. I recommend it. It'll cost you the best part of £100 for both volumes. It's called The Matter with Things. And I mentioned this particular book. First of all, it's a masterwork. I've never read anything as all-encompassing and as important as this. But he had he discovered this guy. He was introduced to this guy who he interviewed for or had conversations with, which he talks about in part of the book. And this guy made his living from having some kind of extrasensory perception about horse race winners, and then recommend being a tipster. So, and getting paid for it, making a very good living, not like super rich or anything, but making a really good living doing this based on impressions he was getting from somewhere else and in dreams and stuff. And when he tried to understand what was happening, his method just kind of fell apart.
Yeah.
But often he would just go, before going to the race course, he would just spend quiet time. And a bit like some of the great scientific inventions by scientists who just sat in a quiet room before, for hours contemplating. Information about the winning horse would come to this guy, and he, sold tips or placed bets himself, whatever. I can't quite remember. So just interesting you mentioned horse racing.
Yeah.
But I think this again is a difficult discussion to get into the fundamental nature of reality, even in the time that we have left. But I think if you allow for things that we think are fundamental laws, like the limits of time and space, if they're not actually fundamental, it allows for everything that gets described as paranormal, supernatural, ghosts, UFO sightings, all of that stuff, ESP, telekinesis, it all becomes allowable. It doesn't mean we understand these things or what the mechanisms are, but they become within the realms of possibility then. So suddenly strange anomalies like what you experienced, and people, having precognitive dreams and stuff, they're still very unusual. And when I say unusual, actually not actually that uncommon, but they still fascinate us, and we still have no real idea what's going on. But they then become something that actually, you can pay attention to this. Other people are experiencing this. So many people have had near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences and encountered strange apparitions and all sorts of stuff that's very, very real to them and may even be objectively real in some sense, but they don't tell other people about it because they're frightened of being called cranks. And sometimes people won't even tell their husbands and wives about, weird happenings that have occurred to them because they're worried about, maybe being locked up.
Yeah, I think it's extraordinary. I mean, when you're seeing something like the Grenfell Tower, and and your friend gets killed in the fire on the 16th floor, and and she was a very spiritual soul as well. She was a beautiful person, and you can't really rationalize why something so terrible would happen to something so beautiful. But I often think about that, and I think 17 years in advance, and I mean, we have many remarkable stories, me and Shona. We've never even had a single date, and we've been married 20 years, and that was all brought together because of intuition. So that's amazing. That's the story for another time. But I mean, you've got so much to talk about, Greg. So we'll have to have you on again to cover more stuff if you want.
Oh yeah, I'd really enjoy that. While we're just talking about precognition, and we have spoken about 9/11, I think if people would like to, in their favorite search engine, type in the man who painted 9/11, they'll find, I can't remember the artist's name, but basically not the only person to have a sense of those events unfolding, but he's actually, one of his paintings shows, the events of 9/11, and he did this many years before it actually happened. Really, really fascinating. That's just one tiny example of this sort of phenomenon.
Yeah, interesting.
It's fascinating. We've got a question from Kevin. It says, can you tell us about Legalise Freedom, which is your podcast, and your work at York Minster?
Okay, so I can see the question. Your camera froze up there briefly, Shona, but if you're still hearing me, legalise-freedom.com. You can spell legalise with an S or a Z is the website. Most of my work in the areas we've been talking about are there. The music stuff is scattered all around the web. But it's a podcast that I run, and everything you need to know about it is pretty much there. I celebrated 10 years of that last year. I've done 400 shows, and that's my main focus at the minute. Second part of the question, I have what I call a matrix job, which I absolutely love. But I call it a matrix job because it's kind of the thing that you do because you have to put, as George Bush said, you have to put food on your family. So
or throw it at them.
Yeah. So I work in heritage tourism as well, which is in other areas of life I'm very interested in. I like to travel, and I'm interested in history. So that's something else that I do. Not really a lot to say about that as such.
But it's a very interesting place to visit up there, isn't it?
Yeah. Where have I got it? I think I can actually. Can I reach the book from here? Where is it? Where's it gone? That's not it. Oh, so I was trying. Here it is. By coincidence, this is something that I've been increasingly looking into, and something I'd like to work on in future. And this book has got a lot of content related to it. I don't know if I can get this on camera. Let's just try, because the way your camera's orientated is a little bit. So, The Secret Language of Churches and Cathedrals.
Oh yeah, you got that.
So very, very interesting big lump of a book here. So then we get into really interesting areas about sacred geometry, and
we're fascinated with that as well.
And masonry, the Masonic tradition,
Roslin Chapel, and that,
where the designs of many buildings like this, but others as well, temples and all sorts, where they come from historically, what they're grounded in, why the shapes matter, what the symbolism means. And a lot of that has actually been lost. You talk to clergy now, even in Gothic cathedrals or Norman cathedrals in this country and around Europe, about the nave here in the central area of the church. There's an idea that the shape of that is imitating the groves in a forest, where maybe our ancestors thousands of years ago had shamanic, maybe even psychedelic experiences, as part of their rituals. And so this design is developed because they did it out in forest groves, and maybe this is like the branches of the trees coming together up on top, and they'll just look at you like, what?
Well, but the thing is, I mean, if you actually do some research into religion and secret societies, there is an extremely strong theme of mystery schools running throughout it all. And that's exactly what they used to do. They used to take, I think it was Kaikion for the Lucian Mysteries, which had ergot in, well, ergot being the mold on wheat and grain. But ergot in a certain dose actually does produce these hallucinogenic properties in people. And it was used. They have actually found, I think it was Girona in Spain, they found at an Eleusinian temple some remains of ergot in a cup that they excavated.
Yeah, yeah, and those means and methods again were very important at the time, very important for thousands of years. They later then sort of kind of became proscribed and banned, and then later found their way back into culture and society through illegal drugs, psychedelics.
LSD,
LSD, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of some meaningful experiences for people, but a lot of psychological damage done as well.
Yeah.
And now we have a thriving psychedelic research community, with medical practitioners and qualified scientists conducting trials and doing some very, very interesting work. There's a whole bunch of content on that at Legalise Freedom. But of course, the mainstream attitude is still that, oh, these are illegal drugs, and you will be sort of prosecuted for buying or selling or owning these. The softening up of marijuana legislation that you see in various parts of the world, whether it's like officially in some US states making it available to buy and sell legally, no penalty there at all, or whether it's a kind of what I call a soft legalization, or a lot of what happens in this country, the police just turning a blind eye because they got bigger fish to fry. We don't have time to start busting people for a couple of joints.
Exactly.
All of that you can read as well. It's at its worst, marijuana can be a lot like alcohol. Really, it can just be a way for people to just numb themselves. One thing I noticed about people who smoked a lot of weed was talking a lot about being very productive and being the exact opposite. So, and if you look at dystopian literature, look at Brave New World, for example, by Aldous Huxley, and the Soma. There, you had a drugged up population who were basically on uppers, so that no matter how squalid their circumstances became, they felt happy. So you can look at that. And I'm not, down on people. Whatever people want to put in their bodies, go ahead. And I guess marijuana can be very relaxing, quite fun, and you certainly perceive, visuals and audio in a quite entertaining way as a result. But you can read this as a subtext of subjugating a population by just drugging them, basically making that stuff freely available, especially if we're moving into a time which was foreshadowed very much in the pandemic of not the end of work, but a lot of opportunities for productive labor and activity for people being taken away due to mechanization, technology, and artificial intelligence, and more people sitting at home on the dole, on a government handout, food stamps, have some weed, watch TV, Netflix, lager and Netflix, as they said during the pandemic period,
Exactly, become apathetic, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also in another favorite dystopian tale of mine. Actually, it was a film that George Lucas of Star Wars fame, he developed when he was a film student, and later made a proper version of it, THX-1138. That whole society is basically just dumbed down on drugs. I mean, watch the film if you haven't seen it. It's so prophetic to so many things that are happening now.
Yeah.
You got medication in a pill, religion in a pill, but human relationships themselves, contact between people, the most disgusting thing in the world, love. That's basically the attitude of it. And the echoes of those sorts of stories that were heard again in the pandemic period are quite uncanny.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's say, rather than being prophetic, they're more planned, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So, but again, you talking about your dream that you had, about the horse, etc. If you start thinking about what I was talking about, time and space in a wider context, then fictional stories from decades ago could easily be tapping into what were perceived or would have been perceived as future events, or what we now think of as future events. But really, that the future, everything's happening at once. In one sense, there is only now. There is only the present moment, and that's so counterintuitive for us to think that past, present, and future are all accessible, all happening now, and that what we perceive as the future can actually change the past. Now, how the hell does that work? But again, if you have to kind of liberate your thinking a little bit about some of these fundamentals, and then all of that suddenly becomes allowable, but as I said, maybe not explainable.
I mean, I think it's interesting as well because sort of talking about the perhaps the use of hallucinogenics and things going back over the many years. I mean, you only have to look at the 60s for an example, and I'm in no way condoning taking drugs or hallucinogens or anything, but it's interesting to note that the time of LSD, look at the proliferation of such amazing pop music, for example. The music then was really quite different and inspirational, wasn't it? Very colourful period.
Yeah, and there's been, it's interesting because from a musicological point of view, you can look at different types of drugs that produce different types of music. You know, you're right about psychedelic music, and not just one particular type, not just say, for example, you know, like a Pink Floyd or whatever, but, you know, even say the Beach Boys could have been influenced by drugs, you know what I mean? Quite different music on the surface of it. But I remember I was never a goth, but I was very interested in the music. I liked a lot of what was the gothic rock that came out of the post-punk period. So the Sisters of Mercy, even though Andrew Eldritch denies that the goth band, well, I don't know, practically definitive goth band in many ways, Fields of the Nephilim, The Mission, Bauhaus, bands like that. And I was told by a lot of people who are really into that scene, who were full-on goths, remember those days. They said a lot of that was about amphetamines. You know, a lot of those guys and girls and stuff, that the scene, kind of the recreational drug was speed, you know, and a lot, they said, it makes so much sense. You know, if you like snort some speed and listen to this music, it's perfect. So yeah, you can draw these parallels between different types of drug and different types of creativity, you know, or, you know, creative outlet, whatever it happens to be. And you can apply that to visual art or to, you know, other things as well, not just music. And there's some famous writers who were absolutely mashed on all sorts of you know, whether it was like in the romantic period, you know, with what's the green stuff called, the alcohol,
I know what you mean, absinthe.
Yeah, exactly. Or you know, opium or whatever, you know, in different periods of time that's been a common thread. So but all that is, whatever you think about drugs, legal or otherwise, in their ingestion, it's consciousness altering. And as the similar experience we have when we dream at night, ingesting some of these substances just shows you a wider or deeper reality, or how, you know, different way of viewing things. And I've tried quite a number of drugs, you know, whether it was like powder or whether it's naturally occurring things like mushrooms or LSD, whatever, because I was really, really curious and I wanted to be able to speak from experience to some extent. So trying some of those things a couple of times allowed me to see how that works. I think that all those levels that you access with those experiences, including even just drinking wine, I think they're available to us all the time anyway. But sometimes we benefit from that little jolt out of our, you know, normal waking conventional consciousness into something, you know, a bit different.
I mean, on a sort of a more naturalistic way of doing that and accessing these things, I would suggest is meditation.
Yes.
Although it's more of a thing over time that develops rather than instantaneous. But that opens the doors to the mind and the consciousness, I would suggest as well. But it kind of gets me thinking, you know, with the mystery schools and the use of psychedelics and things, you know, they had the most amazing buildings and temples. I mean, we look back at medieval times, going back to, say, York Minster, for an example. What an amazing, incredible feat of engineering and architecture that is.
Yeah, and this is why it's an insult to... I'm very interested in ancient alien theory. I don't necessarily mean the TV show Ancient Aliens. I think that's just pure entertainment. You know, it's kind of ridiculous and entertaining at the same time, although there are some credible researchers that appear on it. But the ancient alien hypothesis, as popularized by Eric von Daniken, I think it's an insult to, for example, to say of the people who built Göbekli Tepe in Turkey or the Great Pyramids in Egypt, that the people around there, the human beings, couldn't possibly have done that. So it had to be space aliens.
Yeah,
you know, it had to be the whole, you know, sort of what's the popular movie called, Stargate? You know, as entertaining as that was, it had to be an off-world species, because we just weren't up to it. These hunter-gatherers couldn't possibly have quarried and cut and carved and erected all these stones.
Well, I mean, the thing is, when you actually start looking back through history, it really tells you don't have to be an expert to realize that these people were highly advanced and highly civilized people. I mean, if, for example, look at the Antikythera mechanism, which was found off the coast near to Crete. What an amazing instrument that is. I mean, they're only just sort of starting. I mean, it's supposed to be over 2,200 years old. But the current thinking is that it was an orrery, which is a model of the solar system. So they could calculate and track celestial time. I mean, goodness.
Well, yeah, I mean, and so many of the, like, for example, are thousands of years ago. I mean, human history becomes very hazy very quickly. When you get back to the end of the last ice age, we can say not a lot about that. As to during the ice age, pre-ice age, who knows? It's where stories about Atlantis and Lemuria come from. But even 20,000 years, 15,000 years ago, our ancestors had worked out that the Earth was a globe. Not all the measurements were exactly correct, so how did they do that? They had to travel around, for starters. Yeah, they could use observations of the stars, but they had to travel around. So I think that not only were our ancestors pretty much the same as we are now, to be honest, in some ways better, but certainly capable mentally and physically of everything that we are. But they're much more in touch with each other than we're led to believe. We think of these scattered bands of people eking out an existence in little pockets around the world, and I think there's certainly evidence.
Lied to, I think.
Exactly. I mean, history is certainly not what we've been told it is, and I think certainly through my learning and researches and everything else, I've come across so much that tells me that it's not what we've been told.
Oh, absolutely not. No.
History at best is a partial truth. So even if you take that everything in the history books is true, it's only part of it. Look, if I was to start a account of history that was everything that happens in my city, then I would fill up Encyclopedia Britannica in a couple of days, because it would include everything from next door's cat visiting the vet through to the fact that it was raining earlier, now it stopped raining. That would be everything that's happened. So of course history doesn't record that. So that allowing not every event that's been left out of the historical record is insignificant. The idea is that, everything that's significant is there. It's not. There's been loads of things that are huge implications for our present and our future that we have maybe no inkling about, or at best a very dim inkling, in some kind of species memory. The popular one, for example, being the antediluvian disaster, the idea popularized by a number of authors that basically there was some kind of global disaster. This is not only in the flood myth of the Bible, and that's repeated all around the world, but that something really bad happened, maybe something from the sky, and it almost wiped us out. And that maybe even today, our psychological dysfunction is down to having that species trauma, and we haven't processed it properly yet. So, but so many people have a sense of that. There's something that happened in the past, maybe more than one thing. Human beings have been to the brink of extinction, I think, more than once.
I think so. I think it really is just cyclical. I think that civilizations rise and fall over eons, and it's just a repeating cycle. So I think that the Earth and the human race is far, far older than we're being told.
And as one of the listeners has just pointed out, pyramids on every continent. So it's evidence for a global seafaring civilization, which is completely counter to the narrative we have of a long arc of progress, that the only way is up, and that we're actually the pinnacle of human development. I think, again, if you just want to look at, Celebrity Love Island on Ice, X Factor edition, and say that that's the peak of human achievement, well, it clearly isn't.
Yeah. Well, I saw a picture of a guy trying to get a huge sofa in his the back of his car the other day. I thought, we haven't progressed very much, have we?
No, I mean,
over the head with a club.
Anyway, on that note, I just want to say, Greg, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute delight talking to you. It's been really fascinating. And thank you for joining us on the Allens Investigate. You can check us out on www.theallensinvestigate.com and on Facebook and Instagram. And just to say that we're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 and 107.7 FM from New Orleans, and also on Roku. So thank you so much, Greg, again. It's been a pleasure to meet you. Bye.
Bye, Greg.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gary and Shona. See you sometime in the future.
See you soon, yeah.
Bye-bye.